You're in hell, and your eternal punishment generally involves a whole lot of paperwork. At the start, you're signing contracts before stuffing them in the out tray. Then, you're ticking surveys, not long recycling. Like the premier document dystopia, Papers, Please, there's way more paperwork than you have time to deal with. Though, in Hellfiler, there's just a never-ending stack of forms to fill out. Ultimately, it's little more than a silly gag of a game, but hell, if I didn't dig it, nonetheless. Another chaotic game next, it's Genre Hopper from Fishmug Games. This WarioWare style romp is all about changing between different game genres. A simple
Что пошло не так, причем сильно не так, бывает. Интересно. Частично только лишь. Так-то все так, но не так. Но ты не так, но ты не тот. Но ты не той. Ну ладно.
Platformer might morph into a space shooter, or a Doom-style FPS, or a Zelda-like action RPG, all at random intervals.
А что сейчас работу надо искать, найти работу, где работу найти? В музыке нет, музыки, ну вот на, вот это есть. Ну вот это, обвалка, да. Нет, что-то да. Да. Я не полагаюсь на эти обвалки, где-то всякую замечательную, не то. Да. Она вся ни о чем это работает. Если бы они такие, ох, ну наконец-то ты пришел, нам мы тебя заулили сразу. Ты нам всем нужен, на тебе там по 50 баксов вообще авансом. Ну как бы, нахер не сдалось, если не пытаться, да. Я же тебе объясняю. Ну да, композитор. От балды называется. Да. Шут гороховый. То есть если ты умеешь, если ты музыкант, ты можешь, да. Я тебе еще секрет раскрою. Композиторы нахер не нужны сейчас. Никому не нужны, называется, наверное. Ну ладно, короче, долго. Музыкант просто, понимаешь? Человек музыки, да. Ну неважно. Но это уже твое дело, что для тебя. Человек бунга, тоже человек музыки. Но это понимаешь. Это не в обиду, это просто реально. Главное, чтобы ты деньги зарабатывал и реализовался как-то. Что-то реально. Ну, наверное, нормально, если ты добро делаешь, что деньги. Ну, конечно, да. Ну, да. Ну, это долгий разговор, да. Вперед, все вперед, да. Ну, людям надо. Зачем надо, это ты, мужик, должен выяснять сам. Сам по себе. Видите, вас нормально. Так это ли не кайф, это ли не прикольно, да.
What's really clever is...
Вот как Моцарт, он там писал, потом оп, такой начал какую-то фигню гнать, и не такие. И мода уже пошла, и не такие, ну нахер. Ну там, да, понимаете, да. Надо было работать с собой лучше, да. Ну, там уже не до этого было.
That the level design and enemy placements don't change between genre shifts. This makes the change between genre way easier to handle than you might expect, especially as the speed of the game rapidly ramps up. Right now, it's a single-screen proof of concept with just a handful of genre types, but I can totally see this being expanded into something bigger with a bit more time. Another surprisingly prevalent idea in the Jam was the involuntary shooter pattern. Games where you endlessly fire out a column of death or a barrage of bullets, and so have to carefully position yourself in a way as to avoid collateral damage. Take Laser Gun from Laser Team. You play as an alien in the midst of an allergic reaction that causes him to shoot a deadly laser beam out of his face. And so you'll need to carefully navigate your way to the infirmary without frying your co-workers in the process. So what looks like a manic twin-stick blaster is actually a careful puzzle game. It's about working with the level design and the predictable patterns of the other characters to get around without causing damage. In fact, there's an almost stealth-like feel to the game, only in reverse. You're the one with the vision cone, after all. There's one really clever addition to the formula that puts the laser guy above the crowd, destructible objects. While
Блин, бабушка умерла, бабушка. Вот это все. Там, понимаешь, все вообще. Такое вообще, блин, все подожди. А для чего? Вот именно так еще.
Walls will always stop your laser beam, cabinets and desks will burn away after a couple seconds, and metal stuff lasts longer than wood. Clever stuff all round. Next up, you are now possessed by Lonebot, which, judging by the scores, won over pretty much everybody who played it. So the game is a turn-based puzzle game about getting to the musical instrument in each level. But, as the name might suggest, you're not in complete control over your movements. The bar at the bottom of the screen shows you when you get to move yourself and when the game will make movements for you. This means you need to think very carefully about your next move and think ahead several steps to where those automated movements will lead you, hopefully not off the side of the level. This is a remarkably polished game, and if it had a few more levels, you could buy this on Steam and not even know the whole thing was made over one weekend. Wonderful stuff. Edna, Out of Sight, Out of Control, is a game by KKs and Varun Ramesh, and it has a great idea which is explored to a pretty striking extent for a 48-hour jam game. So here's the concept. You play as Edna, and if you get one of these tiny knights in your sightlines, as visualized by a pink arrow, you can then shift control over to them and move them about, until the sightline is broken and now they're out of control. Huge props to the devs for giving you a split-second moment of control over the character as you lose influence. It's a tiny bit of leniency which adds so much to the feel of the game. Anyway, this smart concept lends itself to some pretty smart puzzles about placing characters on pressure-sensitive buttons, using characters as platforms to make jumps, and even using movable mirrors to boost your sightlines. And then, once the game starts introducing the concept of chaining together sightlines, well, there's no end to the puzzles the devs could put together. The top 100 was chock full of great tile-based puzzle games about robots that I'd love to recommend, like Alice and Cell Machine. I mean, I wish I could talk about all of them, but here's at least one that definitely deserves a top spot on this list. Losing Control by Indieberg is one of the most inventive games I had the pleasure of playing. It takes something we're all intimately familiar with, copy and paste, and applies it to a puzzle game. So you can highlight a bunch of tiles, hit Ctrl-C, and then press Ctrl-V to paste down a copy of those tiles, creating a path for your little robot friend to move across. The developers quickly find new ways to spin this idea, like lava, which spreads from tile to tile. You'll figure out that you can actually copy and paste the empty void to create gaps in the level and stop the lava flow. Right now it's a little easy, even with the limitation that you only have a limited number of copy and pastes in each level, as you literally become out of control. The puzzles aren't exactly stumpers. But for a 48-hour game, this is super impressive and really deserves further exploration. Top marks for this one. Alright, one more robot puzzler. Emergency Protocol by Tyrix and Haru is about a tiny robot who can move freely on green tiles. While you do so, your movements are recorded, as shown by arrows at the bottom of the screen. Then, when you drop onto the grey tiles, you lose control and your recorded movements are repeatedly played back. So to get from one island of green to the other, you need to record a sequence of movements that will safely guide you across no man's land. It's a really simple idea, but immediately lends itself to clever puzzles that will have you stumped. It's a game where a single green tile can have you pulling your hair out with frustration. But when you get it right, there's a real sense of satisfaction from seeing your plan come to fruition as your little robot buddy automatically shuffles across the screen and gets itself to safety, all based on commands you carefully set up. Speaking of games where you have to think ahead, meet Time Lock by Marshall Cannon. This is the sort of game where the only person you can blame is yourself. Here's the deal. Each level is split into a handful of tiny rooms, and your actions in one room can sometimes be recorded and then repeated in the next. So in one room, your character might be jumping about like a loon, but it's actually entirely based on when you jumped in the previous room. So the game is about thinking ahead to ensure that you solve one room in a way that will make your life easier in the next. It sounds complex, but smart design makes it extremely obvious how everything works. A clear timeline system shows your actions being recorded and played back. It's easy to see the level in its totality so you can plan ahead, and you can quickly go back to the previous room and re-record your movements. All in all, this is a super original idea and very quickly generates tricky puzzles with just 3 actions. You can easily see how this idea could be expanded and explored in every direction. Crystal Ball Chaos by Yogurt, or Yogurt, is a really enjoyable platformer with a unique idea at its core. Basically, you've got to get these crystal balls to their plinths, and the only way to do so is to smash them with your magic wand. This causes them to bounce around the room, ricocheting off walls like the ball in Breakout. You'll also need to knock away skulls which damage you upon impact. There's potentially a lot of mastery in a game like this. Not only do you have to get the ball in a goal with a well-aimed whack like a golf game, but you've got to do it while simultaneously controlling a character. So there's lots of room for mid-air thwacks and other such techniques. I ended up having a lot of fun with this one, and even though the crystal balls are out of control, it's not annoying because you have so many options for redirecting them to their goal. Something else now. Two Timing Towers from Zachary Richman and Pals is a tower defense game that fixes the most obvious problem with the genre: the boredom of sitting back and watching your impenetrable death machine rip through enemies. So what's the fix? It's to change your role from an omnipotent god to a tiny mechanic on the battlefield, and to give the towers friendly fire. Which means the game instantly switches from a breezy strategy game to a bonkers, out-of-control bullet hell nightmare. And this gives the game a big dose of dynamic difficulty. The stronger and more powerful your defenses become, the more deadly the battlefield is to navigate. Good luck picking up currency and health pickups when the screen is from an omnipotent. Though the crystal balls are out of control, it's not annoying because you have so many options for redirecting them to their goal. Something else now. Two Timing Towers from Zachary Richman and Pals is a tower defense game that fixes the most obvious problem with the genre: the boredom of sitting back and watching your impenetrable death machine rip through enemies. So what's the fix? It's to change your role from an omnipotent god to a tiny mechanic on the battlefield, and to give the towers friendly fire. Which means the game instantly switches from a breezy strategy game to a bonkers, out-of-control bullet hell nightmare. And this gives the game a big dose of dynamic difficulty. The stronger and more powerful your defenses become, the more deadly the battlefield is to navigate. Good luck picking up currency and health pickups when the screen is completely awash with ordnance. There's a similar bargain to be made in Midnight Monorail by Default Frogs. This game is about drawing out tracks so trains can run from one tunnel to another. The only way to get points, though, is to create stations by having tracks cross over each other. So very quickly, you'll be at risk of trains colliding, and will need to click on one to turn it incorporeal for a split second to let the trains pass without a crash. Like Two Timing Towers, it's tempting to make your train tracks as profitable as possible by creating endless crisscrossing stations, but every crossing increases the chance of collision and gives you more fires to put out. Soon enough, the whole thing gets completely out of control. Both of these games put the level of control in the player's hands, though Two Timing Towers, with its ever-encroaching enemies, does a slightly better job of actively encouraging the player to push their luck. Make the Way from Vimlark asks the question: if the character is completely out of your control, how do you get them to their destination? The answer is by slapping down boxes, platforms and springs in order to build the level around them. This was another popular take on the theme, but many games in this pattern suffer from issues of trial and error and a disconnect between building the level and then watching it play out. Make the Way solves these problems by having everything run in real time. You'll often need to place down a spring only when the character is in motion, and can even pick up and place down an object after the robot has used it. It makes the game feel fast, frenetic and responsive, though it definitely ends up being more about precision than pure problem solving. One thing I'd love to see is some kind of reward for finishing the level with fewer objects than you get in the toolbar. While every level has an intended solution, it seems, it feels great to finish a level in a way that goes beyond the obvious answer. Here's a slightly different take on that idea: Dumber Dwarfs by Deep Night. This is a dungeon crawler about beating up imps, avoiding boss monsters, and picking up gems. But the catch is that your adventurers aren't actually in your control. They'll walk around automatically, and all you can do is manipulate their AI by plopping down tasty meat or slapping them silly. It turns the game into a slapstick strategy game about herding cats and putting out fires. What makes it
Я, да, интересно. А что будет, если так вот? Мы с ней там посмотрим. Блин, из меня мудацкая судьба, ну ладно, что жалуешься? Много хуже могло быть. Кто-то скажет, что наоборот, что тебя вообще все гениально. Не надо, отлично. Возможно, но я этого не понимаю, понимаете? У меня ценности нету такой. Я папа, кстати. Я не знаю, это нормальная ценность. Нормальная ценность быть реализованным, быть мужиком в обществе. Реализованным там. Женщину иметь как бы, чтобы она, да, все как нормально, да.
really work is clear and predictable.
Она ненормальная. Значит нормально. Ну да, или чтобы она тебя имела. Какая нафиг разница уже там? Ну важно вроде как. Ну, короче, женатым быть как, да? С семьей там. Да, чтобы любовь была как-то там, или просто даже нормально, короче, понимаешь. Может в этом все дело, может и не совсем.
Routines. The dwarves tell you exactly what they're doing with speech bubbles above their head.
В этом-то и дело, что ты не реализованный какой-то личность, ну отсюда, да, то есть все упирается в то, что именно вот, ну исходя из этой теории гипотезы, да, то есть если для тебя центральное это действие, скажем так, да, а все равно все будет к этому приходить, то есть, ну да, кто-то такой, как, ну да, вот я один, как вот я свое тело, что я знаю, в этом обществе муравьиных, да, нет, сам Маугли, короче, Маугли не считал, сам будешь, ну, бегает, да, кого-то обманываешь, когда тебе надо соскрести какой-нибудь там, что будешь, что здесь, как бы, ты долго не поживешь, когда, ну, да, ты уже сразу же, ты родился и уже сразу, как бы, часть всего, да. Да, И это нормально, это хорошо. Мы так и хотим быть этой частью. Ты на детей-то посмотри, что они творят. Ну да, что он. А, ну теперь да. Сами последние, ну я понял. Ну да. Не знаю, точно у них тайна какая-то.
And arrows towards their destination. This wasn't the only game like it. It was a close toss-up with Mini-Map, which is more of a puzzle game as you only have a limited number of chances to influence your adventurer. And Shield Bearer, which has you bouncing the real hero away from danger with a shield bash. Shooty Balls by Team Shevin is a fun, addictive and juicy twin-stick shooter that turns out to be one of the most elegantly designed games in the Jam. Here's the premise. You're not worried about... your own health, you're worried about protecting the green ball that sloped the premise. By Team Shevin is a fun, addictive and juicy twin-stick shooter that turns out to be one of the most elegantly designed games in the Jam. Here's the premise. You're not worried about your own health, you're worried about protecting the green ball that slowly bounces around the screen, protecting it from yourself. That is, because the only way to break it is to shoot it. But you can't just spend your entire time trying not to hit the ball, because the game has a control gauge that's always ticking down, and when it hits 0, this happens. You turn into a bullet-hell boss monster and spew ordnance in every direction, with only a hint of control over your movements. Good for killing lots of enemies, but it puts your green friend in a lot of danger. So how do you keep control? By killing red enemies and picking up their yellow eggs, and putting yourself at risk of shooting the green ball. Oh, and the red enemies multiply if they touch, so you'll want to kill them, and the eggs hatch into more enemies if you don't pick them up quickly enough. Basically, the developers have managed to mine so many interesting ideas out of only a few simple elements, and they all aim in the same direction, to force you to play loose and fast and reckless, but always with one eye on your bouncing green charge. It just feels great, and I can't recommend it enough. Okay, what about a game where you have full control over your character, but the world itself is out of control, like the raging rapids of Pink River? That would totally fit the theme. So take the wonderful Between a Clock and a Hard Place by Kira & Co. This cute and claustrophobic platformer suddenly gets super interesting when the entire world spins around in big chunky increments every few seconds. Suddenly the wall is the floor is the ceiling, up is down, down is left, and now we're flying towards spikes. That idea alone would be fun enough, just look at the similar Rotato ship, but where a clock takes it to another level is by introducing physics objects that still have normal gravity even when the level itself is spinning. So this giant pendulum will always swing towards the bottom of the screen, which means you can trap it between some boxes, wait for the room to rotate back around, and now you've got a path to the exit. It's like a teeny tiny side-scrolling Zelda dungeon. I love it. The devs squeeze a lot out of this idea in the game's short runtime, but there's definitely potential to take this idea even further. Okay, one more game. This theme came bundled with something of a trap. Many developers would be tempted to make the character itself be out of control, maybe dragged around by a manic dog, or hopelessly attracted to the very bullets you're supposed to be dodging, or just every now and again your buttons stop working. These games can be a lot of fun, hence them all being in the top 100, but you have to be very careful to not introduce frustration, tedium, or just the sense that the player is, well, out of control. Unless you just lean right into it. Cleaning the System by Nashik shouldn't be any fun. You play as a stick with a spring on each end, and all you can do is slowly rotate the stick. This means your character is constantly bouncing all over the place and springing out of your control. It should be the most frustrating game, and yet I've finished it 4 times already. There is an incredible source of satisfaction from getting this crazy double-ended pogo stick under your control and manipulating it into getting through the level. Every successful bounce is a cheering moment of glory. Every busted bounce that sends you flying back through the level is a hilarious sight to behold. And there's just enough room here for speedrun style mastery. You can learn more about the physics of the game and improve your ability to get through the level. There's a snake pass-like quality to wrangling this nightmarish control scheme and becoming a true master of the pogo. And there we have it. All of these winners will be given some free GMTK merchandise. I'll be in touch. As for some honourable mentions, sure, why not? Remember that these games are only from the top 100 for fairness. So, Dukemeister mixes up a stealth game, super hot, and kiting enemies in Dark Souls. One Last Game is an affecting vignette about playing checkers during a war. Chess Dungeon is a roguelike with the tricky movement restrictions of chess pieces. Bonsai Fairy is about nipping at branches to make the perfect tree. Press Control is a mind-bending meta-adventure. Pongen has you simultaneously playing a dungeon crawler and Pong. Don't Heroes is a Paper Mario inspired RPG where your heroes have a suggestion and all you can say is don't. And Inefficient Delivery Man is a funny game about delivering boxes in the most roundabout way possible. You can browse all 5,000 games over on itch.io, and you can now also see the rankings for all the games. Thank you so much to everyone who took part in the jam, or chatted with us on Discord, or watched my streams where I got increasingly manic as the hours ticked past.
Bob, I'm not even doing anything. Bob, stop. Bob, no. Bob, no. Bob.
The best little software out there. I still have yet to see anything else that competes with it, so it has to be the best because it dominates this category.
I really like the software, very easy to use. I was able to actually add even in some of my own graphics. It took me about an hour to make about 5-minute video, and it was fantastic.
Hey there, how's it going? If you look at the games I make, you can probably see that I really like pixel art. The NES, SNES, and the Game Boy were the systems that I had during my core gaming experiences growing up. So I guess it makes sense that now that I make games, I tend to make 2D sprite-based pixel art games, because to me, when I think of what a game is, I go to the platformers from the early 90s, things like Mario 2, 3, World, as well as Mega Man and Mega Man X, and plenty more. Let me know in the comments what your core games were growing up that still pop up when someone says game. Also, the algorithm demands that I let you know. While you're at it, you should click the subscribe button and ring the bell. So all of that was a really roundabout way of saying that I've seen a lot of people making some pretty cool pixel art stuff lately, and I want to try it too. I don't normally make pixel art as art, and what I mean by that is I don't usually make art to just share. I'm usually always making sprites with some sort of purpose to go into a larger project. I realized I kept bringing this up while I was on my stream lately, so I decided I'd finally give it a try and actually see if I could make some art for the sake of making art that looked cool. It's so weird, everything's been interactive for so long. The thought of making something to just look at it seems a little weird. I also get a good amount of questions from people asking how I make pixel art or how I approach making pixel art, so hopefully this can be helpful to other people by seeing my progress. Okay, so I know I want to make something, but now the really hard part, trying to figure out what to actually make. I'm really bad at this. If you give me a blank canvas, I will sit and stare at it for hours without knowing what to make. But I do really like restrictions and challenges, so I figured I would give myself one that I knew I wouldn't really like, but I think would be fun to explore. So I'm tasking myself with one of my least favorite color palettes, the 4-color Game Boy Color palette. If you do like the Game Boy Color palette, please take this as my subjective opinion. I just really don't like it. And this is coming from someone who played a ton of Game Boy growing up. I had the original, the clear purple, the pocket, the color, but I have no nostalgia love for that green screen, unfortunately. But from an art perspective, just working in the shades of green presents a pretty fun challenge. Only having 4 colors max requires you to think a bit differently about making sure that everything is readable on your screen. So since I'm doing the Game Boy Color on a Game Boy sized screen, I thought it might be fun to see what my game Monkeys with Guns could have looked like had it been made on the Game Boy. So that's my challenge set.
Выучить язык за несколько месяцев. Очень просто. Выделяем время, начинаем учить язык, берем самую быструю систему из существующих по изучению, а для этого в языке есть большое количество разных задач. Отсюда мы под каждую задачу берем свой инструмент. Если вам нужно заговорить Давайте по нашим примерам. У нас есть девушка, которая с абсолютно нуля свой первый язык испанский в 8 классе выучила до уровня носителя языка, что не делают 99% выпускников лингвистического факультета за 5 лет. Свой первый язык выучила за 6 месяцев, с нуля до носителя языка. За 3 месяца не просто заговорить, а заговорить профессионально и сдавать международные экзамены, таких людей десятки и сотни, а то и тысячи. Отсюда за несколько месяцев заговорить вообще не составляет сложностей. Месяц, два, три, и вы говорите на языке, на абсолютно любом. Если в день уделяете примерно час-полтора времени, правильной системой занимаясь, если вам нужен результат быстрее и больше, вы делаете это просто быстрее за счет большего количества времени в день. Но это все при условии правильной системы изучения. За всю школьную программу редко кто запоминает больше, чем 500 иностранных слов. У нас за 500 иностранных слов вы сможете запомнить за один день. За один день. Но если вам не нужно это делать за день, то на бесплатных вебинарах мы запоминаем по 20, 30, 40 иностранных слов, умножаем на каждый день, получается по 20 минут в день. За месяц у вас получается 1500-2000 слов. Просто если вы запоминаете их 20-30 минут в день. Отсюда пользуйтесь правильными инструментами. И первый из них это запоминание слов, потому что без них вы не можете читать, без них вы не можете выполнять паттерны или говорить, без них вы не можете понимать на слух. Поэтому первое это слова. Сделайте себе норму слов каждый день. Хотя бы это должно быть, если вы хотите быстрого результата, 30, 40, 50 в день. 50 это всего лишь 1500 в месяц. То есть больше, чем 90% людей знает в России иностранных слов, но меньше, чем нужно для того, чтобы свободно говорить и понимать. Но для ЕГЭ, во всяком случае, хватит. Второе – это изучение грамматики. Вам не нужны учебники, вам не нужны схемы, вам нужен пошаговый курс, который объясняет грамматику на майнд-картах. Мы каждую тему объясняем минуту, 2-3 в виде простой схемы, визуально запоминающейся, но это абсолютно бесполезно, как и любые видео по грамматике, до тех пор, пока вы не вывели это в навык. Никто бокс не принимает устные экзамены по боксу, то есть как нужно подворачивать руку, что нужно делать, просто потому что это бессмысленно. Бокс переходит в навык, как и вождение автомобиля. Отсюда грамматика нужна для того, чтобы выполнять паттерны. Паттерны – это способ имитации речи, когда в час вы делаете 1000, 1500-2000 фраз. То есть примерно в 5-10 раз больше, чем вы делаете при разговорной практике. При этом это подобранные фразы, которые вы делаете идеально правильно.
Let's see how it goes. I opened up Sprite and loaded in the built-in Game Boy Color palette and set a canvas size of 160 pixels wide by 144 pixels tall. Knowing where to start is always difficult. Here, I began by blocking in the spikes to see how much area I will actually have to play with once they're in. After roughing in the spikes, I went to make the blocks into the level layout, but I quickly realized I didn't know what size I was going to need. Figuring out the monkey's size and look was probably more important. Luckily, I've been making these monkeys for a good while now, and I'm pretty accustomed to translating their shape and size down to something a little bit smaller. Here they end up being about half the size of the original. Adding the guns to the monkeys ended up being a bit tricky because it was just kind of looking like a big dark blob right in the middle of them. After trying a couple of different approaches, it made more sense to just give the monkeys larger guns and not give them the pistol. That way the silhouette of the guns would be more easily readable to the viewer. With the monkeys made, it's time to take a look at the blocks again. Now I have a better understanding of what size they should be in relation. I've made them fairly simple to not be too distracting, and I did definitely think that I was making them look more like the destructible blocks from the underwater section of Super Mario Land, but it turns out when I went to look I was way off. It's the thought that counts. Now to give the spikes a bit more definition. I gave them an outline to help them pop and stand out from the background, as well as some rivet-looking shapes along the sides to not just have a giant solid colored bar. Threw some highlights on the high spots to give even more separation, and we're pretty much good. I don't often use the mirror drawing tool in Sprite, but it came in really handy making it so that I only had to make one side of the spikes. Okay, so now we have the basic components of the scene. It's time to lay out the level. To add a little more interest, I wanted to make the spikes breaking at least one block like they do in the game. So I made some block chunks and smoke to make it feel like it just broke. The blocks up top look a little bare, so I added the heart pickup from the game where the players could regain their health. With that in, I now have a large hole in the upper right portion of the composition. Luckily, another key feature of Monkeys with Guns is the fallen gun crates. The crate and the parachute weren't too bad to put together, but they were a little finicky to just get looking right. and the parachute gave me a headache for a little bit. But after tweaking and adjusting, I think it looks pretty good. This is a good example of how when people ask me how to make good pixel art, I usually just say to just keep messing with it until it looks right. Since I'm trying to make a game scene, the players need their UI with a life bar. Funnily enough, I changed the life bar to look more like it did in the early prototypes I had of Monkeys with Guns, where it's a pellet style system as opposed to a continuous bar. I just feel that at this size, it's more easily readable to see the health bar when it's broken up into segments. To add some more interest and action to the scene, I made the right monkey shooting, and I spent way too long trying to make that smoke look good. And the last main element to add is the timer that sits at the top of the screen. I consider it one of the most important parts of the game because when it hits 0, that means the spikes are showing up. Funnily enough, you wouldn't think that a 0 would be so finicky, but it took a bit to get this one to look right. I'm not sure why. And then last but not least is the background. My apologies for the jump. I paused the recording to do some family stuff and I didn't restart it right away when I sat back down. You only miss me hiding the layers and making this brick grid, which is fairly standard. To not have the background be too stiff, I softened up all of the corners of the bricks and I added in a dithering effect to the top of them to just give them a little bit more definition and depth without having to add any more colors. And this part ended up being long, tedious, and boring, so we'll skip to the end. With the dithering, it all looks a bit too uniform, so I go through and I start erasing parts of it and adding in some cracks to just break up the sameness. I added another projectile coming from the other monkey as well because it would only make sense that if the other one's firing, this one probably should be too. I did some quick touch-up to the numbers and that's it. This is my take of what Monkeys with Guns would look like on the Game Boy. I'm sure it doesn't follow all the actual sprite rules and restrictions, but I like it, and I couldn't just leave it there. The next night, I started playing around with the idea of animating this. This is another area that I haven't really dabbled in before. My sprite animations are typically 4 frames because they're meant to be quick little loops, but building out a whole scene animation like this was pretty fun, I have to say. Luckily, I kept all of the elements on different layers, so all I had to do was animate them individually one at a time. Now, this is not a fast process. This is pretty slow and pretty tedious. A-Sprite allows the preview window on the right to constantly play the animation, while I work on individual frames on the left. To make the animation work, there was a few new things that I had to make, like extra numbers for the countdown, as well as the win message at the end of the round, the player death, a couple of other things. It took me a little while to figure out how I was going to make the whole thing loop, though. And since there's no clean way to do it seamlessly, I decided to go with the end of level transition from the game. After a winner's declared, it zooms itself into the camera and then zooms itself back out to reset the GIF. And here's what the final animation looks like. For being my first attempt at an overall animated pixel art scene, I'm pretty happy with it. Sadly, I don't have an actual Game Boy, let alone the ability to put this on there to check it out, but I do have the magic of video editing software, and wow, look how cool that looks. I had a lot of fun with this, and I'd really like to do more pixel art videos in the future, and I really want to do some that aren't all green. Speaking of which, let's pull the actual black and white of this and see how it feels. Ah, much better, but it pulls a lot less at the nostalgia heartstrings. If you enjoyed this and would like more pixel art related videos, please let me know down in the comments. And for those that wanted to know, I hope this gives a bit of insight on how I approach creating art with tiny squares. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'd like to give an extra special shout out to my amazing Patreon supporters, especially Abishan, Claude13, Daniel Martin, David Scott, Hunshrup.
У него там патреоны бегают, у меня наоборот. Я понял, что да. Я, да.
Nightfall, Kevin Hauga, Kirby, Kormai, Liam Sorta, MLK, Motzi Mace, Nazar Salim, Salty Pretzel, Scott Hansen, Soapy No, and Straight Up Rental. You're all awesome people, and I really can't thank you enough for all the support. If you want to see more pixel art or just want to get in touch, come say hi over at my live stream at twitch.tv/filmlark. Or you can message me on Twitter or join the Discord with a lot of other really cool people. I hope you're all healthy and safe wherever you are, and I'll talk with you next time. Have a good one. Later.
Что это такое? Что это такое Кузбасс-Кович там? Кузьмус-Кович? Да, вообще безобразие какое-то. Что они там в интернете такое? Иди туда учиться. Нет, не учиться. Там никто не пишет. Хочу маме, значит, нет, немножко. Я уже устал жевать. Зубы крошатся вместе. Чем я Евгений. Так. Здравствуйте. Понимаешь, люди хотят, да. Да, люди тоже. Пока ножки. А, вот эту штучку я тоже побрал. Наоборот, зачем мне Facebook? Ты что говоришь такое о себе? Он себе так хочет сделать, да. Мне не касается, не надо делать. Чтобы ты знал его, да. Нет, его видео так нет. Свои хочет, да нет. А, ну нет, помогать мне что ли? Да наоборот, не надо. Я-то здесь при чем? Нормально, значит, играет он, да. Формат, ну просто все, черт проклятый. Сказал бы я.
One of the responsibilities I think we have as designers is to protect the player from themselves.
Whenever a designer makes a game, they'll have certain ideas for what would be the most enjoyable or interesting way for a player to approach things. For example, Jake Solomon reckons that XCOM is at its best when the player is taking risks. He told Rock Paper Shotgun, risks are what lead to loss and what lead to triumph. But players will often have other ideas, because many will simply gravitate towards strategies that will most likely lead to success, regardless of how enjoyable those strategies might actually be. So they grind, they use repetitive tactics, and they play slowly and cautiously. As Civilization 4 designer Soren Johnson puts it, given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of a game. He was talking more about exploits, but I think the quote still works. And this is kind of what happened in XCOM. Players rarely took risks because why would you? Instead, they found much more success when they moved slowly, played cautiously, and overused the Overwatch ability, meaning they often ended up playing each mission in largely the same risk-adverse way. But the awesome thing about design is that the game's developers can tweak things to make sure players approach the game in the way they think would be most interesting. The question is, what's the best way to do this?
Money. Если просто рост становится, да. Что нормально, не надо.
The most obvious answer would be to add some kind of system that will stop the unwanted behavior from occurring. And that's exactly what Firaxis did when it decided to introduce turn limits to standard missions in XCOM 2. Many of the game's missions will have some kind of time limit. Hack the network in 8 turns, destroy the relay in 6 turns, extract the VIP in 12 turns, and if you don't finish that objective within the time limit, the mission is failed. And this means that inching slowly across the map like in XCOM 1 is now massively discouraged, and the player is forced to move more quickly and take more risks. A very similar thing happened in the making of Spelunky. Creator Derek Yu says, "I never intended Spelunky players to collect every piece of treasure, get every item, or explore every room each time they play. Instead, I wanted to force them to make difficult decisions and experience both the satisfaction of choosing correctly and the regret of choosing poorly." So he added the deadly ghost enemy, which appears at about 2.5 minutes into every level to put pressure on the player and discourage them from dawdling around. Now, both of these decisions had the intended effect, but they were also met with some amount of controversy. Spelunky less so, that's a long time to spend in one level. Besides, the ghost doesn't actually kill you, you can still run away and finish the stage. But many XCOM 2 players hated the turn limits and even made mods to rip them out of the game. "I didn't expect people to have such a strong reaction to the timers," says Solomon, and turn limits were greatly reduced in the game's expansion, War of the Chosen. So what went wrong? Well, there's a bunch of things. Many people simply just enjoyed playing cautiously in the first game and expected to do so in the sequel. And Solomon suggests that maybe there's a clumsy thematic wrapper on the turn timer. But one thing is clear, some players will always react negatively to punishment. And in XCOM 2, the fact that refusing to speed up and take risks will see you fail the mission at hand means that these players felt that the game was punishing them for playing in a certain way. And there's a famous story about World of Warcraft, which I've never played, so excuse me if I screw this up, but in the story, Blizzard didn't want people to play the game for too long. So they introduced a system in the beta where the longer you played, the fewer experience points you'd get for killing monsters and whatnot. But players hated it. They hated seeing the numbers go down. It felt like a punishment for playing the game. So Blizzard did something pretty clever. They flipped the system on its head. Now, players can build up a rest bonus whenever they're not playing the game, and then get an experience points boost when they next log in. It's essentially the same numbers, says Blizzard, but making it a reward rather than a penalty made it much more agreeable to fans. So it's often better to encourage the behavior you want than discourage the behavior you don't. Instead of punishing a player who is too slow, reward a player who finishes the level quickly. And there are loads of good ways to encourage player behavior. It starts with the fundamental moment-to-moment gameplay, where designers can tweak the game's most basic mechanics to push players towards a certain style of play. Take the latest Doom, where the designers wanted to promote an aggressive sort of push-forward combat. One way id Software achieved this was through the glory kill mechanic, which provided plenty of compelling reasons to close in on your foes instead of running away and firing from a safe distance. This move instantly kills an enemy, it doesn't use any ammunition, and it showers the player with useful health pickups. And so, despite years of FPS games training players to run away and hide behind cover, in Doom, players spend much of the game racing headfirst towards demons. Likewise, Bloodborne encouraged players to be more aggressive than they were in Dark Souls by adding the rally mechanic, which lets you recover health if you
Да. То есть, да, хочешь там, да? Ну это всяк. Нет, просто проявление агрессии из животного мира, в принципе, да. Из наших страстей, мы же тоже живем. Ну, помнишь, конечно. Ну, давай ампутируем тогда что-нибудь. Потому что видишь, оно? Да, я понимаю. Ну и что теперь? Да, понимаю. У них выхода нет, поэтому. Да и ты не захочешь такую жизнь поганую жить. Ты хочешь как таракан, который слепой и ничего не видит. Нет, если вот ты понимаешь, если. Ну ты понял меня, тут популяция сумасшедшая просто. Ты понимаешь? Ну это моя гипотеза просто, да? Смотри, таракан, ему чтобы выжить надо, ему 89-е чувство, чтобы ему выжить. И то как бы единица выживает, понимаете? Ну они, да. Ты понял меня, да? Да. Просто мы немножко не в адеквате. Немножко слишком спокойно. За себя только, потому что ты же, да, за себя просто все, да. Да. ты вершина этого мира, и тебе никто указывать ничего не будет. Понимаешь? Ты все это сделал себе, холодильник поставил, все. Деньги от Путина получаешь безработный, и все, и живешь себе там. Никто не а оказывается, ты а ты хочешь лучше, оказывается. Ты страдаешь, оказывается. Ну, болезнь, что-то. Ладно. Понял ты, короче. Голос внутри тебя, жизнь, да.
Strike an enemy within a few seconds of damage. Players are less likely to back off and wait for an opening if they have a chance to win back some health with a quick, aggressive attack. Other examples of this sort of immediate encouragement might include the burnout games, where you gather much needed boost by doing all sorts of fun things, like driving close to other cars and racing into oncoming traffic. You've got to drive dangerously to win. And Hyperlight Drifter, where the only way to recharge your gun is to slash bad guys with your sword, encouraging you to get up close and personal with enemies. Encouragement can also be baked into more abstract, overarching systems like scores. In most character action games, you can finish the stage even if you're pretty sloppy and rely on the same few tactics for the whole game, but you'll end up with a crappy grade at the end of the level. To get a better grade, you need to play in the way that the designers intended. So for a game like Devil May Cry, which is all about being stylish, you'll get better grades plus some handy items if you use varied and more difficult attacks and use your guns to keep the combo ticking along. Likewise, Tony Hawk's makes you connect up different tricks to keep your combo going and will give fewer points each time you repeat a move. In all of these games, the only way to get a high score is to play in the most stylish and interesting way possible and to use the full extent of the game's mechanics. Rewards like experience points and achievements can also be used for this purpose because the designer gets to choose exactly what sort of activities or challenges the player must do to earn those points and can tailor this to reward players for taking actions that fit the game's intended experience.
Oh, son of a mother. Tech is wild. This cocky leash is grading my performance.
Now, this is not to say that games should never discourage, punish, or penalise people. This will always have a place in games. But for those games that do focus on negative enforcement, they should be wary of pushing the slider from discouraging a playstyle to practically forcing you not to use it. Not to beat a dead horse, but playing fast in XCOM 2's timed missions is not just the best way to play, but basically the only way to play. Because forcing a very specific playstyle is difficult to pull off. I'm sure we've all played stealth games where getting spotted by enemies leads to instant failure. And sure, this makes you play in a stealthy, ninja-like manner, and it doesn't allow you to just Rambo your way through moments like where you manage to escape and go back into hiding. So the goal is not necessarily to shut down tactics that can lead to uninteresting playstyles. For example, if players are spending too much time hiding safely cover in a shooter when you'd prefer them to run around the battlefield, you don't have to remove cover entirely. It's more often about keeping this stuff as a valid tactic for certain situations, but tweaking them so the player will not abuse or completely rely on them. So you can discourage players from enemies throwing grenades or having cover break over time. Or you could encourage players to stay out of cover by giving them points for fighting out in the open. And to go back to the stealth example, there are better ways to encourage stealthy play than just insta-failing players who get spotted. You could discourage direct attacks by making the player very weak. In the Arkham games, Batman is useless against enemies with guns, so punching the crap out of guards during the stealth bits is a bad tactic. But you can stay alive long enough to grapple hook your way back to safety. Or you could encourage stealth by using the scoring systems mentioned earlier. In Hitman, the only way to get a high score or finish many of the challenges like Silent Assassin is to play in the most sneaky way possible. Never get seen, hide the bodies, delete the camera recordings, and so on. Or one less obvious way to tackle it is to make players more aware that direct attacks are not the focus of the game. With Mark of the Ninja, lead designer Nels Anderson said that the game originally had an in-depth combat system with different stances and parries and whatnot. But this level of depth signaled to the player that direct combat was way more important than it actually was. By reducing the combat to something much more simple, players were not the point. Anderson explained this on the podcast Designer Notes.
So people would try to sneak, they would fail, and then they just you know, Rambo through the rest of the level. It's like, okay, well, we just need to just pare this down, get rid of as much of it as possible, make it really simple. And once we just kept paring it down to like the amount of presence it had in
So designers stylishly, or stealthing like a demon murderer, whatever they think is most fun, or interesting, or thematically relevant. But if a player can reach their goals, from microscopic get health or defeat an enemy, to longer is certainly one way of going about it, but forcing players to meet your vision and is fraught with difficulty. And so, while I personally understand and even appreciate XCOM 2's turn timers in the broad strokes, I'm not surprised that they were met with controversy. So it's often better to encourage and incentivize a player to see the game in the best possible light, to allow for other playstyles, but give rewards, high scores, easy kills, and handy resources when the player is meeting that intended experience. Now please, this is definitely not as easy as I'm making it sound. There are plenty of about, and some of the most controversial and disliked mechanics are those that were initially designed to encourage or discourage a certain way of playing. But when used really well, this type of design can subtly push a player towards having the best possible experience and, like Sid says, protect players from themselves. Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you found this one interesting. I love seeing all the different ways that designers try to encourage and discourage different behaviours, and it's fascinating to see how successful they end up being. I'd love to hear your examples from games you've played or games you've made. If you're a designer, leave them in the comments below if you like. Game Maker's Toolkit is funded on patreon.com. It's pretty obvious where the game's inspirations lie. This game pays homage to cartoons from the 1930s, like old Disney film and Gunstar Heroes, especially their technical wizardry on the Mega Drive to make mind-blowing bosses that filled every inch of the screen and warped and rotated and looked practically 3D at times. I mean Gunstar Heroes, where you switch between the floor and the ceiling to fight a giant of 7 different designs. These old boss fights were essentially the template for Cuphead, which has massive great villains that are really the stars of the game. Look at this guy. Check out this moon. That frog just turned into a slot machine. What? But these bosses don't just look cool, and that's what I want to explore in this video. So let's just ignore you. Huge number of different patterns. Some fly in a straight line, others arc across the screen. There are attacks that bend back on themselves like a boomerang. There's this hateful pattern, ugh. Other projectiles split out in different directions. You've got attacks that move in a zigzag pattern and ones that follow an annoying sine wave, and others that fire directly at the player's current position or slowly chase you around for a bit. Some of these are naturally more difficult to avoid than others, and of course each of these patterns could be made more or less challenging by altering the speed and size of the projectile. But one thing you'll come to realise is that these attacks are ultimately predictable. The dragon's fireball, for example, can go up or down or both ways at the same time, and that's it. These cats always split into 4 mice. Never 3, never 5, always 4. And this means that a big part of a boss battle is just learning about the boss, figuring out and then memorizing its patterns. And these mini self-taught epiphanies stack up to the point where you can now predict and outsmart the boss at every turn, which feels pretty good after having taken quite a beating. Of course, it's not actually that easy. You know that the cat will split into 4 mice, but you don't know exactly when or where it will do so, and you don't know if the dragon will do a fireball next or a psychic ray attack. So you also have to be able to react to the more unpredictable elements. Luckily, the enemy will often announce what attack it's going to do next, either through animation, this is the dragon gearing up to do a psychic attack, and this is when it's about to do a fireball, or through sound, like these walking flames who yell out before they jump at you. Sometimes it's even done through text. This is called telegraphing, and the duration of an enemy's telegraphing will affect the difficulty of the fight. You'll generally notice that massive, difficult-to-avoid attacks will have big, obvious build-ups, while easier attacks don't need to be announced for as long. Unfortunately, not every attack in Cuphead is telegraphed in such a fashion where you can react to it on your first go.